Interacting with Google Cloud Platform. We have many ways to interact with the platform that span the various roles and scenarios out there. So if you need to do some kind of monitoring and troubleshooting, we've got a nice web UI for that. If you need to do operations work, sysops or DevOps, we've got command line tools for that. Or maybe you need to develop against the platform. We've got APIs for that. So in this nugget, we're going to get familiar with all of those tools that we'll be using to interact with the platform so we can be effective in any or all of those roles. Let's jump in. So as I mentioned, we have many ways to interact with GCP. We have three primary ways that again span all those various roles, and then we have a relatively new way so we can monitor GCP on the go. So the three primary ways here are going to be the web UI. This is known as the developer's console, and this is going to be great for a lot of things, especially for getting started, getting your project set up, managing billing, and really all the different roles are going to use this for monitoring and troubleshooting. We also have command line tools, and we'll talk about the Google Cloud SDK shortly, but that's going to give us access to many of the tools that we can use to interact with GCP from the command line. So namely the gcloud utility, but there's a few others. Now operations folks obviously love the command line because they don't get bogged down in the web UI. We can just open up the command line, quickly fire off commands to create and manage our resources up in GCP. And best of all, this gives them access to the power of scripting. So we can make those actions that we perform in the command line repeatable. For the developers out there, we've got REST-based APIs galore. Virtually every product and service in Google's Cloud is exposed via an API, which makes it really the primary method for developers to interact programmatically with our resources in GCP. Last but not least, we've got a really cool, relatively new mobile app that allows us to monitor GCP on the go. And this thing is sweet and really, really simple to use. You can easily switch between Google accounts and even projects within an account, and you can view things like resources, your logs, and you can set up these monitoring cards, which allow you to monitor specific metrics across many of the products and services in GCP. Great little app. All right, let's dig a little deeper into the big three here, starting with the web UI, otherwise known as the Google Developer Console. So the Google Developer Console, again, is that really nice, easy-to-use web UI we're going to be using to create and manage projects as well as manage all the resources within. Some of the common things you'll be doing in the web UI are things like manage billing, give members of our IT team access to our projects and also give them permissions within those projects. Activate APIs. In order to use an API, you first need to activate it. We'll be using Developer Console for that. Set up OAuth 2 credentials. We'll be talking about OAuth 2 here in a little bit, just to give you a high-level overview of it. But essentially, before we can request that a user give us permission to access their data, we need to set up credentials, and that's going to involve setting up a public-private key pair and setting up a client ID and a client secret so those applications that can then interact with those resources, those user resources in the cloud. We can also set up service accounts, which is what we'll need when we need to do server-to-server interactions or we need our application to authenticate to resources in the cloud. And then we can also set up API keys. So if we don't need to access user data, in other words, we don't need OAuth 2, but we still want some accountability, then we can communicate from our application to these APIs using these keys. We also have some great developer tools. In fact, your project gets a free private GitHub repository that you can easily access through the Developer Console. And there's some neat things you can do around this as well, such as debugged deployed code. You can even make code changes to deployed code right there in the Developer Console. And of course, we've also got tons of tools for monitoring our solutions. Access the Developer Console right here, console.cloud.google.com. This guy right here, we took a look at how to work with this a little bit in our first lab when we signed up for the free trial, got those $300 in credits, and created our first project, which is what we're into right here. So you drop down the left nav here, and you have access to your project. So here's where you turn APIs on and off. Here's where you manage billing. Here's where you manage permissions. And as you scroll down, you got access to all of these products and services broken out by category. So there's compute, there's storage, there's ops, there's developer tools, and there is big data. We'll be in this plenty throughout the rest of the course. Now, to get access to the command line tools, we need to install the Google Cloud SDK. And this is becoming more of an optional thing because of Cloud Shell, which is a shell built right into the developer's console with the latest Cloud SDK already installed. And that's awesome because we don't have to worry about installing things locally, which can be a problem, especially if you're in an enterprise, firewall rules, installation policies, all that kind of thing. So this totally gets around it. But I still want to show you how to install this. So we've got a lab dedicated to getting you up and running and installing Cloud SDK. But what you'll do once you install it, it'll give you access to all the CLI tools. We can download it across all the platforms out there. It's also available as a Docker image. And it's going to give us access to all of these utilities for managing GCP from the command line. And the big one is gcloud. So a lot of these utilities are wrapped under the gcloud command. So you do gcloud compute for working with Compute Engine, gcloud SQL, gcloud DNS, gcloud app. But a couple of them, namely BQ and GSUtil, are still their own utilities. It's also worth noting that if you're going to be working with App Engine, you need to download these SDKs separately. So they've got an SDK for all the supported runtimes out there right now, which are Java, Python, PHP, and Go. Now, to show you where you can download this, you can actually get it right through the Developers Console. Drop down the Utilities and More menu, head over to Downloads, and choose Google Cloud SDK. That'll take you right to the docs, and you have some very simple installation instructions across all the various platforms out there. And I already did this. I'm actually on Windows because I've got my Mac sitting right next to me, and I love working on my Mac, but our recording software sadly only works on Windows, so that's why I'm on Windows here. But I installed it locally, and watch this, gcloud version. Hey, look at that. There's our version. So there's gcloud utility, GSUtil, and BQ there. And I could also do gcloud. Oh, I almost did GSUtil there because I'm always working in cloud storage. But gcloud info. Here we go. So what happens is the first time you install this, and we'll go over all of this in our labs, but you'll run a gcloud init, which will walk you through the OAuth process. And that's why I logged in under our cp100.nuggets@gmail.com account, chose our project. So right now, all the commands we execute are running under the context of this account, and we're inside of this project. So now we could easily work with all the resources up in our GCP project right here from the command line. The developer-y way to access cloud platform resources and to build applications around these resources is to use the REST APIs. And these REST APIs are typically going to use the JSON data format. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, very lightweight way to represent data structures. And it looks like this. I actually generated this JSON by using the API Explorer to get a list of objects inside of a Google Cloud Storage bucket. And the nugget immediately following this one, I'll give you a demo of that API Explorer and show you some of the cool things that you can do with it. Great way to learn how this stuff works. We say typically here because, speaking of Google Cloud Storage, GCS does still support an XML API, but other than that, you're going to use JSON for most part. Now, for many of these methods, you will be packaging up JSON and sending that over in the request body. But a lot of these methods also accept certain parameters in the query string, so appended on to the URL. And I'll be sure to point this out in our API Explorer demo because you can actually see it right in the UI. Now, all these REST APIs support OAuth 2 for authentication, you are who you say you are, and authorization. You can access what you say you can access, right? And OAuth 2 is a really, really big and deep topic. It's extremely complicated. Developers have a tough time wrapping their brains around it. But let me just tell you that Google made it extremely simple to work with OAuth 2 in their platform. They provide client libraries that make coding against OAuth 2 extremely easy. Now, if you're not sure what OAuth 2 is, let me give you the quick, 1,000 feet up view of what it's all about. So let's say we were building an application. Here's our application with our fancy UI. All right, killer app right there. See it? So we'll call that our app. And let's say that we've got users out there that are going to use our application, and they want us to build some things in this application that will go out to a vendor, and let's call this Google over here. And let's say that they want to go through our application to hit data they have stored in Google. Say that we're building the next killer app that will take all their Gmail data, their calendars, all their Google Apps data, everything into this really nice, fancy, customized, intranet view or something like that. So the point is that our users have data in Google that they want to access through our application. Now, how we did this prior to OAuth was neither secure nor simple. One of the methods was to take the user's credentials, store them in our application, and then impersonate them when trying to get that data in some vendor. And yeah, not an ideal way of doing things by any means. OAuth came along and solved this problem by giving us what's known as the three-legged flow. You're going to hear that term a lot when you're learning about OAuth. But essentially how this works is the user is going to give our application permission to access their data. So the first thing that'll happen is, let's say our application wanted to read their Gmail and maybe modify their calendar. Well, we would then request from Google servers. We would say, hey, we want to be able to do this to this. It's called scope, is what it's called. I want to be able to access these resources with these permissions. So Google would handle the authentication and authorization part of things. Their authorization servers would redirect the user to a login and a consent screen. So they'd log in under their account, and then they would get presented with a little consent screen that said, hey, do you want to allow this application access to these resources with these set of permissions? And if the user consents, awesome. Now our application can access that user's data on the user's behalf without ever having to deal with or store credentials. That's between the user and Google still. And that's just a really high-level look at how that works. There's a lot more that goes on underneath the hood with authorization codes and access tokens. And if you want a deeper look at this, check out our Google App Engine Qualified Developer course. It's a CP300 course, which is actually getting retired fairly soon. So hang in for CPD 200, where we'll again cover how that process works and of course how to code up the flow. Also, before you use any of these APIs, you must turn them on. And again, you can do that in the Google Developers Console. If you don't do that, you'll get an error. And just to show you, let's go back to the CLI, because all these CLI tools communicate using the APIs. So if we do a gcloud here, gcloud compute regions list, watch this. Because we haven't done anything in our console, nothing is configured. All the APIs are turned off. So this is going to tell us access not configured, the API is not enabled for your project. So you can do this a couple of ways, at least for Compute Engine here. You can actually go right here into API Manager, or just clicking on Compute Engine. The first time you go into the Compute Engine here and many of these other ones, it'll automatically turn them on for you. But you can just go to the API Manager here, and you can click Compute Engine API, and here we can enable the API. Let me show you how to do it the other way though. I'm just going to click on Compute Engine. Watch this. Compute Engine is getting ready, and what it's doing, it's enabling the API under the hood. All right, there it is. So that took a couple of minutes to do, but now if we head back here and rerun our command, we should get a list of regions, and they're there. There's all the regions. Cool. So don't forget to enable your APIs before you use them. Also note that these APIs have quotas, as well as the products themselves have quotas against resources. And in fact, let me just show you these real quick while we have the developer console open here. We're still in Compute Engine. Now these are resource-specific quotas around Compute Engine. These are per project quotas. So for instance, you can have 100 firewall rules per project. You can have 5 networks per project. And these are soft limits. If you find yourself bumping up against these, you can certainly contact Google and ask to get them raised. So these are resource quotas per project for, in this case, Compute Engine. But you can also see your API quotas if you go back into API Manager, choose your API. Number one, you've got this incredible usage area, and all of the usage charts and graphs and monitoring aspects here in the Developers Console are just awesome. But you've also got the Quotas tab for API-specific quotas. Moving on here, Google also supplies us with API client libraries, which are wrappers around the APIs, which make it very, very simple to work with them, right? You can work with them in an object-oriented way inside of your favorite programming language. And we've got support for many languages out there: Java, Python, JavaScript, PHP, .NET, Objective-C, and there's early access for these here. And the library handles all the hard stuff with OAuth 2. What we do is go into the Developers Console, we generate the credentials, which will give us a client ID and a client secret, and we just simply pass these through the client library, and it will go through the OAuth flow for us. So here's a very common workflow when working with these APIs through the client library. The first thing we'll do is get the user's credentials, which means we're going to kick off that OAuth 2 three-legged flow. The flow may ask for the user's login info. When would it ask for the user's login info? You guessed it, when we being the application, needs to access user data on their behalf. And I should mention, yeah, I think I already did mention, but Google makes this so easy in these client libraries. It's literally just a couple of lines of code to make all this function, as I'll give you an example here shortly. And I should also point this out. The OAuth 2.0 playground is just a fantastic little area anybody can go into, and it really takes the covers off the whole process. You get to see your requests and your response. You get to see authorization codes and access tokens. You get to choose what scopes you want to request, and it's just fantastic. Run through that real quick. It's a great learning experience, especially if you're new to this OAuth stuff. Otherwise, I will give you a demo of this as well when we get into our API Explorer demo immediately following this nugget. Now, after step 1 here, step 2 is to authorize an HTTP object with those credentials. And this is where we will provide the client ID and the client secret that we generate in the Developers Console for our application. Then we create a service API object that represents whatever we'll be working with. So this will represent a cloud storage bucket or a Compute Engine virtual machine, and then we'll call methods on that to perform actions against those resources in the cloud. So here's some example code written in Python that uses the Google API Client Library to access objects inside of a Google Cloud Storage bucket. It's almost mind-boggling how easy Google made it for us to handle OAuth in their platform. So we've got our relevant import statements up here. We also then set up our flow from client secrets. And this is, again, going to contain a client ID and a client secret that we generate in the Developers Console. We have full control over that consent screen as well. A couple of things I'll show you again inside of our demo. But we define our scope. Again, these are the permissions that we're requesting for, in this case, the objects inside of that Google Cloud Storage bucket. Then, here is step number 1 in your workflow, right? This is what's going to actually run the flow. We pass in all of our credentials along with our scope, along with credential storage, so subsequent requests will reuse those credentials. Then we authorize our HTTP object, and then we build that storage service object. So right here then, we would have access to all of those, in this case, objects. This is going to get us a list of those objects inside of this bucket. We call the .execute, which will get us a nice big body of JSON representing those objects. And I actually showed you what that looked like back in another slide. I have a GCS bucket in another account named the Incredible Bucket. And in there are 2 images, flowers.png and unicorns.png. So that's what the results would look like. In the CPT Nugget, we saw the many ways we can interact with GCP, from the web UI to the CLI to programmatically with the REST APIs. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.